When I tell people about the moment my life split in two, their eyes always narrow as if they're trying to locate the exact crack. The truth is, it wasn't a single explosion. It was a hairline fracture, invisible at first, and over months it widened until my world quietly fell apart. My name is Wazy Malik, and for the better part of 4 years, I built myself around a relationship that looked like partnership and felt like ownership. He was Amir, handsome, persuasive, the sort of man you think will make every difficult day smoother because his confidence sounds like certainty. We met at university, late nights over studio models and printed plans. He would joke that we were meant to be colleagues first and lovers second, and I liked that about him, the ambition, the way his eyes lit up over an idea. We moved to the city together, shared an apartment with a balcony full of herbs, and promised ourselves that we'd keep each other's dreams alive. Work became our second language. We both loved design. We both spent weekends sketching and arguing about line weights and light. I took pride in knowing the details, material specs, client histories, the cultural context that made a site sing rather than shout. Amir was louder in meetings, better at telling stories. I was patient with the accounting, the timelines, the things that required stubbornness rather than flash. We fit at first. What he called support felt like tenderness. He would rearrange his schedule to be at my presentations, offer a hand when I was nervous, and quietly fix a technical detail I missed. But slowly the compliments hardened into commentary. Maybe don't push that angle too much, he'd say. It's a little try hard. The tone felt small, a sculptor chipping away at what I'd labored to create. I told myself these were personal preferences, not attempts to minimize me. I let them slide. Then a big opportunity arrived, a public commission to transform a neglected riverside lot into a community learning hub. It was my idea, years of research, community interviews, sleepless nights of schematics. I sketched the first concept on a train napkin. I found the local partners. I wrote the first submission. We presented it together at the city pitch panel because at that time, presenting together felt natural. He introduced the project in grand sweeping terms while I explained the specifics, the small things folding into strategy. The committee loved the concept. We won provisional approval. The thrill lasted a week. Then the subtle erosion started. In meetings afterward, Amir began to frame our project as our team's concept. And when he spoke to certain council members, he positioned himself as the lead visionary. I'd nod and correct small facts, and he'd smile and say, in front of others, Wazy means business, she'll handle the details. A joke, he told it to be flattering, but the pattern repeated. In casual conversations, at dinner with potential funders, in whispered interviews with curators, he retold the story of how the idea was born, and in his version, it looked like him. The first time someone called me Amir's partner in a press piece, my stomach turned. A journalist had quoted him without asking for my name. They listed him as the project's creative director. My name was a sentence at the bottom of the article. I called him, my voice thin. He laughed softly. It's marketing, Wazy. Men talk like men. I'll call them back, they'll fix it. He promised. The article changed to include my name the next day, but the slight taste of being overlooked lingered like metal on the tongue. Small things mounted. Amir would take the lead in client meetings that were rightfully mine. He would rephrase my solutions in simpler terms and present them later as his own clarified versions. When I suggested a social program tied to the hub, he would say it was an amazing new direction, and then recast it as an extension of his earlier concept work. The pattern was maddening because it wasn't just theft. It was rewriting the narrative of my competence. When I confronted him in private, he would look genuinely surprised. I always credited you, don't be dramatic. I started to doubt myself. Was I asking for too much when I wanted recognition? But then there were the emails, the signed minutes where he was listed as project lead. That cold ink is harder to argue with than gaslight. The tipping point arrived at a late night meeting where we were supposed to finalize the community partnerships. Amir, in an attempt to impress a city patron, promised the patron a personal design role and in the same breath suggested shifting the project's emphasis in a way that would cost months of work and redirect most of my team's responsibilities. It felt like a betrayal. He had compromised the integrity of a project I had modeled on community needs because he wanted a shiny credit and a relationship with someone who could get him more visibility. I pushed back. I said, "We built this listening to the neighbors. This change risks alienating them." He nodded at first, then looked at the patron and smiled as if the patron's interest validated him. Later, when we argued in the car outside the office, his defense was devastatingly simple. I needed something bigger. I needed a win. People remember bold moves. He looked at me with a kind of confusion that was meant to read as hurt. "Why do you always make this about credit, Wazy?" The word credit had become a wedge. I saw then what had been happening. My work was being cannibalized for his name. More than the stolen recognition, I felt the moral wrongness of someone taking the trust of a community and turning it into a piece on their resume. At night, I would sit on our narrow balcony and write lists. Not grocery lists, but lists of what I had done. The interviews with grandmothers who would teach weaving classes, the kids who needed afters, cool tutoring spaces, the way sunlight had to be coaxed into the corner rooms. Seeing it in ink was a clarifying practice. Each line said, "You did this." When I announced that I would register the project's community agreements under my personal steering committee before the next council meeting, Amir was furious. "You can't do that," he said. "Project's a team thing." I stood my ground. "The team I'm representing is the community," I said. It was the first time I spoke like that to him, and did not soften my edges afterwards. He stormed out of the room that day, slamming a door that had always seemed to open easily for his temper. The city meeting arrived, and I presented the revised community charter. I looked at faces in the room, faces I had met in kitchens and on stoops, and I felt their trust under my palms. I finished my talk while the council scribbled notes. Later, a journalist approached and asked about how the project had a truly grassroots philosophy. I answered truthfully. The article that followed quoted me extensively. The byline read, "Wazy Malik, lead community architect." My name felt like an actual person for the first time in months. Back home that night, Amir's silence was louder than his arguments. He paced for a few hours, then said quietly, "You've changed the tone." I knew he meant it as a complaint, but I was not the woman to shrink anymore. I took the notebook where I kept the lists and slid it into the top drawer of my desk. It felt like storing a weapon of proof. What followed was a complicated season of cold wars and small sabotages. Amir would redirect press emails, forget to forward meeting invites, and sometimes reply to messages with a name swapped. My role reduced to partner or assistant. People would ask if we were having trouble. I would lie and say, "Just stress, project pressures." Lying is a soft kind of survival when you are not ready for the battle you are about to fight. But I was not willing to be invisible. I began recording meetings, just for my own memory. I kept meticulous copies of drafts with timestamps. I invited community leaders to sign off on minutes in person with clear notes on who had proposed which idea. I sharpened my voice in public and learned to correct appropriation quickly without shame. When someone misattributed my contribution, I'd say calmly, "Actually, that was my concept. Let me show you the original sketch." The work of claiming authorship felt like reclaiming property that had been half stolen. Every time I did it, I felt a small stitch close. One evening, I found a contract draft in the firm's shared folder where Amir had listed himself as project director and me as support. The version had been uploaded by his account. I downloaded the revision history and printed it. The paper was heavy in my hands, but not overly. Paper is only evidence, courage is what you need to use it. I thought about confrontation, angry emails, public shaming, but I knew performance would not be enough. I needed institutional change. I began to gather allies quietly, colleagues who had seen the pattern, community leaders who knew who had been in whose kitchen that winter, and a senior partner at the firm who had always been quietly kind to my work. We built a paper trail and a narrative that could not easily be dismissed as pettiness. When I finally presented the documentation to the firm's ethics committee, it felt like a legal deposition of my life. The committee took weeks to investigate. There were tense meetings, awkward conversations, and the professional equivalent of a waiting room, suspended assumptions. Amir argued that it was misunderstanding, and that teamwork sometimes means integrated credits. I showed the drafts, the time-stamped sketches, the signed community minutes. It was messy and humiliating and necessary. The committee concluded that Amir had intentionally misrepresented the division of labor and that corrective credit would be issued and his leadership responsibilities for the project adjusted. It wasn't total vindication. He kept his title on some smaller deliverables. He didn't resign in shame, but the corrective report was forward, facing an official. My name was never again erased from the project. The community center opened with a plaque in the lobby acknowledging the steering committee, with my name listed first. The first time I walked that building alone after it opened, I felt something like whole. But winning at the firm did not erase the bruises at home. The relationship could not be unmade into what it had been. My trust had been punctured. When we finally separated, it wasn't with dramatics. It was practical and sorrowful, like letting an old coat go because it no longer fits. People said I was cold for taking actions that would cost him respect, but I'll be honest. What I wanted more than revenge was to stop being the woman who let her life be a backdrop to someone else's story. I left with my notebooks, drawings, and a small bag of clothes. I kept the balcony herbs, my rosemary and mint, because roots matter. I did not feel triumphant in some cinematic sense. I felt relieved and tired and quietly resolved. What I had learned was that indignity is an uncomfortable teacher, harsh but instructive. The lesson I took from it was simple: claim your handprints. When someone tries to rewrite your contribution, show them the marks you left in the mud. In the months after the formal correction, work became my laboratory. I began to refine what I wanted to build, not just in wood and glass, but in ways of working. Studio ethics morphed from a policy on paper to a living thing. Credit norms in meetings, transparent minutes, a centralized archive with time-stamped contributions. I took a role on the firm's internal committee to reform authorship practices, not because I loved bureaucracy, but because small rules protect people who otherwise get flattened by charm and spectacle. I also needed to rebuild my sense of self outside the firm. I began teaching a community design course at the same center we had created. Standing in front of students, mothers, teenagers, part-time carpenters, was different from facing a panel of stoic council officials. When I explained how space could hold memory, people leaned forward and asked questions. A young mother named Layla told me that the community center had changed her child's after-school life. Her gratitude wasn't about recognition in print. It was about children learning in rooms built to let them explore. That, I decided, was non-negotiable. Yet the emotional undercurrent remained. Amir continued to live in our city, in the same orbit of social events and exhibitions, and sometimes our paths crossed. Once, at a symposium, our eyes met across the room, and he smiled with the practiced ease of someone who expects forgiveness by default. It's a strange thing to watch someone move through the world as if nothing has changed under their feet. I felt a surge of an old self angry, wanting spectacle, and then a deeper response, gratitude that I no longer needed to be spectacle's audience. Professional success came slowly but steadily. The community hub led to smaller commissions, public parks, a school redesign, adaptive reuse of an old warehouse into affordable co-working spaces. We started a mentorship program that specifically prioritized junior designers from underrepresented neighborhoods. Each time I trained a mentee to keep clear records or introduce themselves confidently in meetings. I felt like I was creating scaffolding for someone else so they wouldn't be erased. My life outside work also changed. I reconnected with friends I had let slide in hectic seasons. I cooked more often, not because I had time, but because cooking taught me patience and pleasure in small things. I learned to take afternoons off for no reason and to say no to things that felt draining rather than nourishing. Compassion moved back toward myself in a slow reconnection. One winter evening, a well-known magazine asked me to write a long, form piece about authorship in design. I wrote candidly about how institutional structures prioritize presentation over process, about how gender and charm play into who gets credit, and about the small but important rituals that protect creators. The piece went viral within industry circles. The response was immediate. Young designers sent emails that were part confession and part plea. How do I keep my work from being taken? And mentors wrote to say they plan to change practice in their firms. I received an invitation to speak at a national design conference. When I took the stage, I told the audience, if you are this profession's future, then guard the small things, because small things become the scaffolding of legacies. The movement that followed wasn't about me. It was about standards. I sat on panels where we argued for transparent contribution logs. I advised startups on contracts that protected creative authorship. I watched as other women in my city began quietly keeping their meeting notes and trusting themselves enough to name their ideas out loud. It felt less like revenge and more like a structural correction. Push against an imbalance and the system reveals a better path. Of course, old memories are stubborn. There were nights I would open an old folder and feel the ghost of being called dramatic or too much. But those nights were shorter and less frequent than before. My notebook, once a ledger of injuries, became a journal of work, local partnerships, design iterations, a list of students who had found kind mentors. I redefined the narrative in ink again and again. Something unexpected happened around the second year of this new life. Amir reached out through a mutual colleague to ask whether he could present a joint talk with me about community design. There was a practical element to it. His firm had just been invited to bid on a civic plaza renovation and wanted a credible partner, but there was also a personal subtext. I considered saying no. But I also saw an opportunity. Standing side by side in a public space would show a different form of power. My name could be read alongside his and not dwarfed. We agreed to co-present. Behind the scenes, I insisted on clarity, a shared outline, pre-agreed credits, and a jointly authored paper that would be submitted to the city archive. He agreed. When we presented, I spoke first about grassroots processes. He spoke second on urban integration. Afterwards, the audience asked many questions, but the only thing that felt different to me was the way we answered, as colleagues, not as predator and prey. After the talk, people came up and thanked me. A young architect said, "I loved how you emphasized listening." A council member said, "Your paper will be referenced for years." Standing there in the hallway, I realized how far I had come. The names were no longer being played like marionettes. They were anchors in a shared practice. It's strange to watch a life assemble itself in ways you did not plan, like houses built by hands that learned to measure and not be intimidated by the architects of old stories. Over the years, Studio Lumen expanded into a cooperative, and we launched Handprints, a program where communities could co-design their own spaces. We worked in neighborhoods that had been neglected and turned corners into places where elderly neighbors could teach crafts and teenagers could rehearse plays. I watched the ripple effect of people who had been told to quiet down and then taught how to speak. One of the early mentees, a woman named Amina, led the redesign of a schoolyard, arranging seating and plants so the children could have safe, sunlit corners. She later told me, "You taught me to write my name on the project minutes." That sentence, humble and exact, became a treasure. Public recognition came and went. Awards were nice, but the weekly emails from people who had changed a meeting practice or established a record, keeping ritual meant more. Once, a council member told me publicly that the hub's governance model had become the template for other projects. The city asked that our community-based design guide be published as a resource. I printed a small run and handed copies out to neighbors who had been with us from the start. And Amir, he continued his path. We were sometimes at the same events, sometimes not. Years later, we were both invited to a mentorship dinner, and for the first time in many years, he walked over and genuinely smiled. "Wazy," he said, "you changed how I think about these things." It was a simple sentence, and I accepted it. Forgiveness, I learned, is not always a grand act. Sometimes it's an acknowledgement that other people can change. He had adjusted some of his practice. Good. The world was better for it. By then, I had fallen in love again, not as a person who sought approval as validation, but as a woman who wanted presence and partnership. Someone who could say no as easily as she could say yes. The person I loved next was patient in a different way. He asked questions and waited for answers rather than telling stories for me. Our life was ordinary and extraordinary. Small dinners, projects that lit up neighborhoods, the comfort of someone who applauded my sentences and let me applaud his. One Saturday, a journalist asked me in an interview how I would advise young designers facing appropriation. I said, keep traces, keep drafts, keep voices. Build your structure so that your work can't be copied without witnesses. But build also a spirit of generosity. The work matters more than ego. She asked if that sounded conciliatory, and I said no. It's pragmatic. It's survival with a conscience. There are days when I walk down a street and see children playing in a courtyard with benches that I helped shape, and I feel that old ache transform into calm. There are times when a mother thanks us for bringing light into a dark place. Those small, quiet thanks are the currency of my life. If you ask whether I had revenge, the answer is yes, but it's not what you see in movies. My revenge was structural and patient. It was making systems that protected creators, teaching others to speak, and building places that remembered the people who lived inside them. It was the slow architecture of reputation, the paperwork, the truth, telling that turned a hairline fracture into a healed seam. Wazy, someone asked me once, "Do you ever wish you'd handled it differently?" I thought for a moment and said, no, not in the ways that matter. I wish I had seen sooner how much harm tiny words can do. I wish I had taught myself to keep records earlier. But who I am now, the woman who knows how to build and how to protect, she is worth every late night and every difficult conversation. When the city named a small lane near one of our community projects Handprints Lane, I stood at the corner and watched residents pass by. A child ran up to me and asked if I had made the benches. I nodded and his face lit up. It was the smallest triumph, but the sweetest. Recognition not because of a headline, but because his life had changed in a way he could feel. So yes, he tried. He tried to make me small, sometimes with intention and sometimes through the culture that made appropriation easy. But in the end, I rebuilt the thing he tried to own. My voice, my legacy, my right to mark the world. I learned to keep records, to claim authorship without shame, and to teach others to do the same. If you're listening and you've been told to shrink, I'll tell you what I tell my students. Keep your sketches, keep your minutes, teach your neighbors, and show up for the small things. They become proof. They become places people can trust. Build that scaffolding. One day you'll walk through a space and someone will look at you with gratitude, and you'll know that the last laugh was not loud or cruel. It was simply the world remembering who you always were.